Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, as-salatu was-salam ala Sayyid al-Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to our another exciting and relevant session on transformative Islamic education by Dr. Abdullah Sahin. Today's session is going to be focusing on how to implement transformative Islamic education in Maktab and Madrassah setting. So far we've been looking at more kind of the theory behind all of those things. So we looked at what, the key concepts around what this transformative Islamic education looks like, and then to bring it to kind of a more academic level, we explored the ideas of Imam Ghazali, and now we're coming to how we can take those concepts and the thinking of Imam Ghazali and similarly other scholars, and how we can implement it, embed it into our institutions. So today's session is going to be around that, inshallah. As always, what we're going to have is today's session. I think Dr. Abdullah is going to talk for less than normal time, so probably about 20 minutes to half an hour, so that you can have a longer time to ask more pertinent and practical questions that is relevant to your institutions, and then hopefully that will create a more fruitful discussions and conversation. So we are going to be here for an hour. It might run over by another 5-10 minutes or so, but of course you do not need to stay with us after an hour. You're welcome to go, but of course you're welcome to stay if you want to. So I'm not going to say any further. I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Abdullah Sahin now, and he will continue with his session, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, Hoja. Welcome.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah ala din al-Islam wa tawfiq al-iman wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you, Brother Fawzul, for this kind introduction. This is our third seminar. I'm hoping that there will be some who were with us during the last two seminars. This concept of transformative Islamic education, we were trying to unpack the concept in much more detail. And today, we aim to see the feasibility, the practicality of this concept, how it could shape and guide practice, and that is, one of the obviously important dimensions of any kind of educational theory. And if you remember, the idea was to think distinctively in terms of education, pedagogy, learning and teaching culture. When we look at how we introduce Islam to young Muslims within the context of communities, community-based institutions like maktabs and madrassas, effectiveness of this, challenges of this. So the kind of transformative approach to Islamic education is really one perspective on how best we could facilitate this process. So I'll try to speak for 20 minutes, and I would like to really hear more from obviously the participants, their questions, maybe comments, reflections. I'm hoping that there will be a mixture of practitioners, maybe parents, maybe interested people, even maybe researchers, so that we really enrich the discussion. So I will briefly remind the basic features of this transformative Islamic education, so you can have an idea, those who are just joining us, and others to kind of refresh their memories. And then we are looking at from the context of UK, although it has implications worldwide, but we are looking at Muslim minority context of UK particularly, where we have a distinctive institutions, maktab and madrassas, that are really been operational since the migration story of these Muslim communities. These are community-based, attached to a mosque, often sometimes carried out at the weekend, sometimes after school, sometimes it's called supplementary provision. But it is an activity that happens quite regularly within the communities, and particularly UK context. It is slightly different from Islamic schooling because this is a kind of an informal type of Islamic schooling, but it's very close to Islamic schooling movements, what they are trying to achieve. So my major area for reflection today is to say, right, we've heard this transformative Islamic education. We're probably aware of different models, how learning and teaching of Islam is organized within the communities. Is it fair to say that we do need a kind of a paradigm shift in our attitude towards maktab and madrasa education? Are we happy the way things are? Or do we need to rethink and maybe even call for a bit of paradigm shift? And bear in mind, we are raising this question as people who are within the practice. So I'm aware of sensitivities if somebody tells you from the outside, often lately are plenty of governmental agencies and their expectations are quite different, of course, and there are political pressures. There are plenty of expectations of this sector to be changing itself. That has merits and it has dangers, challenges, but those who are within, who are part of the process, either facilitating or receiving and parents, we need to really have that trust that do we need to genuinely raise some difficult questions about the sector. And then we'll hopefully have a bit of practical sort of step description of if we do want to implement this transformative Islamic education, how could we do that? And then we have question and answers. Okay, now this is my sort of summary of what we have discussed last two sessions when we looked at fundamentals of education in Islam. We've identified a key concept, we call it Tarbiyah, which we believe it indicated a kind of a dynamic, transformative process of learning and teaching, where the learners are really to be at the forefront of the process. So I have identified 10 principles, which I think summarizes the transformative education. First of all, it got to be delivered within a context of safe environment, and it got to be based on trusting relationships between teacher and the learner. It has to be learner-led experience of nurture, care, and guidance. And it must facilitate, clearly, an effective Islamic literacy, by which I mean knowledge and understanding of Islam. It is a crucial learning outcome of the entire exercise. But this knowledge and cognitive-based aim is equally balanced with another ethos, we call it spiritual character development, because the concept actually means in Arabic growth and nurture into faith, building confidence, building values of respect, empathy, and appreciation of diversity. So we obviously had explanations each of this in the past seminars. So this Tarbiyah, the transformative Islamic education, has to be also aiming to somehow facilitate this growth into faith, spirituality, and values. But above all else, it has to foster imagination. That's a crucial another dimension of this transformative education. If you can't engage in attention of learners, you can't obviously foster imagination. So when we say imagination, we mean inspiring the learners. Which brings us to another principle, which we can summarize as the developmental needs and the contextual reality of the learner seriously. So obviously, we're talking about a group of young learners, probably age 5 plus, up until maybe 16, 17. So you have childhood and we have adolescent phases. So clearly this education provision has to respond to the developmental needs of these two distinctive group of learners. As you can see, probably currently, this distinction is lost. So children from 5 to probably 13, 14, 15 years old, they are really experiencing the same kind of practices, it looks like, from the existing provision, while children's developmental stages are different. And then in terms of actual teaching practices, the transformative approach requires to be using reflective, motivating pedagogies. That means practices of teaching and learning, so that we inculcate love for learning. That's a crucial dimension of the whole model. It is not much really the outputs as such, but it is inculcating positive attitudes towards learning itself, and particularly learning, of course, of faith, so that it is not, it's a kind of a pleasant experience. It is not something that unfortunately sometimes could be quite harsh and difficult for children. So it got to inculcate these teaching methods, somehow foster attitudes for love for learning. Okay, that brings us to the 8th principle, which is the central role of the teacher as facilitator. This is a crucial concept. If you remember last time when we talked about concept of Tarbiyah, it is all to do with unfolding, facilitating something to fulfill its potentials. So clearly, knowledge, clearly teacher, they're all there to be part of that facilitation. So really, a murabbi or a teacher in this model cannot be simply an instructor or a trainer. Although there is space for instruction and training skills, but the teacher's role is that of really a facilitator, just a guide, maybe a coach in these early years Islamic education, but not simply somebody who passes, transmits knowledge. I know some of you would say, one of the traditional features of Islamic education is transmission of knowledge, but we have to bear in mind, sometimes people confuse levels. Islamic education at higher education level is different than the early years education. Sadly, we adopt a teaching mode as if we are training an alim, but the learners are simply children. We are trying to really help them understand their faith, basically. So there is a huge category mistake, often adopted, in terms of teaching in the madrassah and maktab sector. We can't assume these children are like miniature adults, basically, that we instruct them into knowledge. This is, sadly, it is not really productive. So the teacher's role is crucial in this model as facilitator, not simply instructor and trainer. 9th feature is, naturally, the teacher does not try to push information in, no matter how sacred the information it is, but really is to facilitate this unfolding child's attitudes, remembrance, emotional tie with the faith, and what is he or she associated with faith. So you can't really push in simply, but you have to listen to the child's development and respond to their needs. And the last feature is to help children during this experience of madrassah and maktab, is obviously to be able to a bit connect and integrate their diverse experiences in the family, in the mainstream school, and the wider society. So madrassah education could be really a capital, an educational capital of ultimately not only connecting the child with parental heritage, that could be culturally based, language based, and religiously based, of course, Islamically based. But the point is, we help the children to develop these skills and competencies of integrating and connecting their own diverse experiences. And children obviously are different at home, at playground, with their friends, and within the society. So we have to understand the kind of diversity of experiences young children go through because after all, we are not living in a monoculture. We are living in reality, really diverse cultural settings, and children experience this at school, at the madrasa, at home, and society. And if there are discrepancies, we have to really help children to understand why there are differences and how could they integrate these differences in their lives. Okay, now these are 10 sort of points that we could actually relate back to the concept of tarbiyah, all of which I think are facilitating a sense of awareness, positive change, and development. Hence, I call it transformative features. They may not obviously seem to be exclusively Islamic, but we have evidence that the concept of tarbiyah as understood in Islamic tradition has actually used all of these features, both in its foundations like the Quran and the prophetic traditions, as well as later it is diverse educational traditions. So here we have 10 features where we can actually use them as sometimes even benchmarks to match and to assess whether what we are doing in everyday maktab and madrasa life matches these 10 points or not, 10 features. Right. Now let's come to the down to earth and look at and face the reality of maktab and madrasas. So we know that these institutions came out as part of a long process of migration of the communities and their settlement. So these institutions, religious institutions, basically, are also embedded within the community. They are enculturation. That means they are institutions where community wants to pass on their values, identities to its young generation. So there is a cultural function of these institutions well before it is religious function. So we understand that. And this, come with obviously a cost, because they become like a place where children are socialized into certain behaviors. They may or may not meet the expected religious and Islamic outcomes or expectations. So there is this cultural function of the maktab and madrasa sector. Each community, and we have to also bear in mind, our communities are diverse. Not only linguistically, culturally, Islam unites all of this diversity, but we have to acknowledge that these practices of religious nurture could well be quite different from community to community. And these are reflected in the madrasa and maktab sector. Often organized around parental interest, expectations, sometimes less about really what child needs are all about. So we got to bear in mind there is a bit of a conflict of interests going on. How do we balance that? It is a crucial ethical question. So as people who are involved in madrasa and maktab education, we need to really always bear in mind, education cannot separate itself from ethics, from morals. If we want children to learn, to be like us, we got to really give space to children to make sense of this process. So the way in which we introduce our heritage to our children, it is a complex process, and we have to bear in mind children's experiences are different from us as parents. So there is an ethical question to be always taken care of, that we need to show the care when we simply say, learn this, learn that, behave like this. Currently, there are always differences, there are always good practices, but overall, I would say the supplementary religious instruction is probably the mode that it's functioning within the maktab madrasa sector. We have fixed, rigid methods of teaching and learning. Sadly, even sometimes, this rigidity coupled with logistic problems, lack of space, creates challenges of even safety, sadly. But this is what is happening. We have to bear in mind this is a large sector. More than 500,000 children attend these institutions invariably, and not all communities have got the same resources. And it operates in a kind of informal level. and not always satisfactory of the values we require. Now, what is crucial is, because there isn't really something we call curriculum that we can recognize, so there aren't really clearly specified learning outcomes. There are no developmental goals set within this sector. You know, a child could come year 5, age 5, finish at year 13, doing the same things over and over again in certain areas. Yes, of course, they do increase in knowledge and they do develop certain values, but these are not kind of assessed or checked the degree to which we achieve them. So it becomes a bit of, controversial to what extent madrasa education contributes to the knowledge, understanding, Islamic identity development of the learners. So obviously, if we had a proper curriculum, a proper planning, we would have learning outcomes, assessments, matching, and then we could have really provide evidence to the parents, for example, this is what your child has achieved or not achieved, or these are the areas where there is need for development. So in other words, the kind of delivery is really not organized still, sadly. And this is understandable because it operates as an informal educational practice. So there are physical logistic challenges, time and resource issues. We acknowledge that. And then obviously that reflects in lack of planning, teaching materials, and most crucially, not all of the teachers involved are really qualified. We have obviously a large group of volunteers, which is very good, but we don't really still have a kind of a resource, a continuous development opportunity for the core staff who are running these institutions. And there are, of course, reasons for this. And finally, obviously, we have to look at evidence, but clearly there are differences between what children experience in the mainstream school and when they go back after school to these supplementary settings. So the teaching and learning cultures sometimes could be quite different, if not conflicting. Of course, ideally, they should complement one another, but there are obvious differences. Okay, so we have strengths and weaknesses. Strengths is the fact that it is an educational activity that enables a golden opportunity to help children socialize into their community values, and then learn about their faith, and hopefully develop Islamic values and put them into practice in their life. This is obviously gives an opportunity. But whether we use this opportunity creatively, whether the energies put into this sector are actually productive in terms of evidence-based practice, is obviously quite far from, because of this complicated set of issues, challenges. And most crucially, the whole sector really doesn't seem to have kind of a research-based professional or semi-professional approach. And I'll explain why I mean that. So therefore, the long process of madrasa maktab education doesn't seem to be offering a very constructive way out for many of the learners. In fact, we don't know whether they achieve what we aim to teach. Okay, so how do we, in a sense, what are the practical steps now? How do we get these 10 features of this transformative tarbiyah into the whole unregulated, so far I would say, neither policy-wise nor educationally, sector? Okay, now I have identified 3 levels I want to share, and I'm hoping that this intervention, these steps are based, on hopefully some sort of evidence and my own experience that I want to share, but also it might facilitate a positive, meaningful internal change. It could inspire. So the first thing, obviously, we have to bear in mind, like any activity, education always, it's framed at a high level, at the organizational, management, and leadership level. So we need to find a way to review this high-level leadership level organization. So what is the vision and the policy of maktab and madrasa? those who are running these institutions, obviously, they may have, they don't have, but they need to really review if they think this transformative tarbiyah actually is an Islamic concept. Then we need to see to what extent our vision, mission, and the policies are actually reflecting this. That will means to check the quality of teaching and learning, some sort of benchmarks, which obviously we don't have, but you could easily develop. Do we have a core professional framing and resources who are running this, with obviously the volunteers supporting? Do we have parental involvement, which is a big question, obviously? And are we able to better sort of communicate aims of Maktab among the wider public? Because there are obviously suspicions due to political developments. So we got to bear in mind this importance of public understanding of Maktab and Madrassah beyond the Muslim community. So this is a high level. Obviously, that requires willingness by the management of these organizations to consider, to review what they do, to look at the goodness and the strengths of what they do, keep them, but also a willingness to change and adapt. Of course, if this is not there, we can't really progress. The second level is, I would say, is to infuse this transformative Islamic education is to make it sure that just before we go to the second level, the organization and leadership also has to find a way to kind of look at the prestige and the value of Maktab Madrassah education. So this is what I mean by particularly whether the sector is attractive enough to young educators, Muslim leaders, educators to be involved and to choose Maktab and Madrassah as their educational career option. Sadly, I know that, of course, the payment is very low, is linked with the entire mosque culture and management, but clearly we have to find a way to make this sector attractive for young, talented educators. But you cannot do this unless you have some incentive, to make it sure that people are properly paid, for example. If you don't have resources, obviously, then there are limitations. But we got to find a way beyond simply piety, invoking a moralizing attitude. This is your deen, you just teach your deen. But these are really not always good motives. You've got to genuinely attract talented people because the sector needs creative ideas, as I will explain shortly. It cannot be simply run by just unqualified people, because the future of Muslim young people's faith and identity and Islamic understanding is at stake. So we got to find improving the profile of Maktab Madrassah education, and particularly making it attractive as an educational career for young educators and qualified teachers. So the second level is to look at now teacher education. This is a significant aspect. We don't still have, sadly, Maktab Madrassah teaching qualification framework. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that we need to really have tight regulations and benchmarks, but we got to have a sense of really quality. The only way you can do that is to have some sort of flexible teaching qualification framework that we could request from those who are going to be involved to demonstrate in terms of competence, skills, understanding in the sector. And this cannot be developed only by madrasa and maktab teachers. We got to get this language of education by collaborating creatively with schools of education, teacher education centers within the universities. And I think this is also a civic responsibility of universities to be engaging with, because the question is, the issue of this madrasa maktab is such a larger topic. It requires such creative collaboration. And I say this because I am part of such a creative collaboration at Warwick. It has only been 3 years. We can see the difference, alhamdulillah, that when you have colleagues who are doing teacher training, teacher education, RE teachers, when you have this interaction between Muslim educators and the specialists in educational field, you can see how creative the whole area could become. And here I must emphasize, you can see I mentioned education departments, teacher education, not much Islamic and Arabic study centers. We have hundreds of Arabic and Islamic study centers, but they are not really educationally framed centers. Their scholarship is welcome, but the point is having an MA or a PhD in Islamic studies does not qualify you to become a teacher of Islam. It's a big difference that we confuse. So we need to respect that education is an independent, interdisciplinary area, and the questions of teacher education, material development, curriculum, you cannot develop it unless you have some understanding and appreciation of the field. That means we need to collaborate with Darul Ulooms. These are Islamic seminaries. Again, in the UK, we have roughly around maybe now 30 well-established seminaries, maybe around 120, 25 small in total Islamic theological seminaries. They have their own pedagogic educational challenges, but the reality is most of the people who end up in the mosque, maktab, madrasa education are graduates of these various Darul Ulooms that belong to different networks. The point is, if this is undeniable reality, a fact, so it will be the interest of the Darul Ulooms to actually, in the maybe last year of their provision, to offer some pedagogic educational subjects, modules, help these young graduates to at least be prepared into ABC of teaching and learning when they go and end up in actually maktab madrasa role. So there is a need to tightly collaborate with Islamic seminaries as to how they could become genuinely part of solution. And then obviously we need to also collaborate with Islamic schools because Islamic schools, it is a very large sector. It's a formal Islamic education now. Again, they have their own problems in terms of teacher education. Although we have roughly around maybe 200 or 300 Muslim schools, but we don't have Islamic teacher education colleges, sadly. So they also have problems. But at least Islamic schools, because of the requirements from the government, they do have trained teachers who can actually disseminate, pass on some of the skills to those who are going to be teaching Islam. Of course, ideally, Islamic schools should again lead on this initiative. But sadly, this is not the case. In fact, many of, it looks like Muslim schools, still children have to go back to madrasa after school to learn about their faith, which is really sad. Okay, the third level is we kind of inculcate a research-based approach, attitude to the theory and practice of Islamic education. So we need to really encourage these young people who are involved, particularly in the madrasa and maktab, to take up research opportunities, to develop kind of a research set of skills to investigate the problems of maktab madrasa teaching of Islam, and then how to develop interventions to engage, to understand how in Islamic tradition, learning and teaching of Islam has been done in the past. What is childhood education in Islam? What is a child in Islamic tradition? So we need to have a kind of a research element in this intervention that will bring about a transformative, really take on education. So if you look at in Islamic tradition, the early childhood education is usually called kutab. Kutab is the basic sort of Islamic education, elementary Islamic education that used to be facilitated within the mosque over all Islamic societies. But we often don't look at in detail what children were learning in these institutions. And we will be, obviously, when we unpack this kutab tradition, you will end up realizing that Muslims develop a distinctive educational pedagogic science genre. Apart from classical Islamic sciences like tafsir and hadith, various Islamic sciences, Muslims were also interested in specialism in really how do you inculcate attitudes, character development, teaching. And this came under a title we can recognize as Adab al-Ta'lim wal-Muta'allim. We've talked about this last week a little bit briefly. And there are literally hundreds of books that need to be studied to look at how Islamic literacy, Islamic character development were all imagined and practiced in our tradition, in our diverse traditions. And this research, will bring, hopefully, much more creativity that we need in terms of educational ideas, pedagogic practices, and also encouraging new type of leadership within these organizations. So the idea is, if we try to infuse these features of transformative education in these 3 levels, the chances are we will engage in developing a broad and balanced curriculum. In this curriculum, of course, we got to have some time and effort in devising this. There will be a space for literacy. The basic Arabic foundations obviously will be the key thing. Different ways of facilitating Quran literacy. In other words, obviously learning how to pronounce Arabic and memorize the basic Quranic text is one thing, but also introducing children to the world of the Quran, helping them to appreciate what Quran is all about, is a second aim. So they could go hand in hand. Similarly, prophetic guidance. Even in the tradition, we have basic maths, poetry, and the reality of everyday experiences of the children and the wider environment. So, this broad and balanced curriculum idea comes from the traditional Kutab curriculum that we have in our history, basically. But I think it makes sense today because it doesn't reduce Maktab and Madrassah experience to a simplistic memorization, repetition, and instruction. It actually quite broadens if you genuinely want to look at Islamic tradition. So we would have pedagogic diversity. That means we shift from the heavy text-centered teaching that is currently happening to balance this with a little bit with thematic experience-based teaching, where obviously the idea that learning by heart, hifz, isn't it, will become learning by heart, not a simple mechanical repetitive experience, but it will be learning by heart with hopefully reflective understanding of what is being protected, memorized, kept in the heart. We can use storytelling, art, drama, play, music-based activities, and that will lead us to adopt maybe a delivery strategy that is quite blended, containing mixture of strategies, including obviously e-teaching and online materials, as we currently, of course, experience the need in the COVID-19 world. So that organized teaching and learning and assessment around the developmental needs of the learners. So Maktab Madrassah education has to be, in my view, if you want to follow the transformative framework, it has to have 2 distinctive stages, childhood and adolescent levels of provision, 5 to 11, 11 to 16, for example. And each of these require genuinely introducing this knowledge, the content, at the level of these different sensitivities of the learners. And we also have to bear in mind that Maktab and Madrassah is a generic education, a generic Islamic education. It is not really meant to prepare children to become alims, faith leaders, or alimas. Yeah, we should not really confuse the targets. What we need to do is, can we ensure our young people, who obviously are going to end up doing different jobs, different ways of life, they develop enough knowledge and understanding of Islam, they have enough confidence and inspiration to remain with Islam in their life and lead an Islamic meaningful life when they are adults, basically. The idea is, can we achieve that? Some of them maybe would like to further go into Islamic higher learning, but then we have to be selective. Then we can suggest this group of children, once they are at the right level, they may be encouraged to take on Islamic higher learning. So the Islamic theological education, the Darul Uloom experience, becomes genuinely productive, where we produce talented, really people into the system, not like now, rather simply open to everyone, and then not be able to actually probably deliver an adequate Islamic theological education. So we have to be aware of our expectations. Maktab Madrassah is all about basic Islamic literacy, faith development, identity development, attitudes, inspiration, confidence building, and then understand them to see the context they are in, but not necessarily try to push them to become like alims at that age. And we need to get grips with the fact that continuous professional development is an essential part of supporting the teachers, just like most of you are in this sector. You would always need support, and that is a crucial support, but we need to always organize this in terms of maybe regional, national resource centers to be able to do that beyond simplistic network sort of interests. So we have we have to really prioritize children's needs rather than simply the kind of school of thought or the network we belong to. We have to really see beyond these limited aims and interests. And finally, we got to have some sort of transparency, accountability, so that we demonstrate what children really, what kind of religiosities they develop, so that we are really not in the business of indoctrinating people. Our nurture, our guidance is producing, hopefully, exploratory, intelligent faith development among young people with skill and confidence to operate within a multi-faith context, which requires the entire exercise to bear in mind the context and hence maybe help to build in intercultural, even I would say interfaith literacy within the curriculum. And then hopefully achieve some sort of demonstrable skills, knowledge, and suluk, that is the kind of personality change that ultimately transformative mode of Islamic education wants to bring about. Okay, I think, let me see, time. I think I have more or less sort of finalized what I want to share this morning. We have, I think, good enough time now for questions, reflections, comments, and sharing good practice. And if need be, we can revisit some of these PowerPoints, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions and comments and reflections.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Once again, another very insightful session and a lot to think about in terms of the implementation of the ideas that you have suggested in a very, very important and a very significant sector. Doctor, can I ask you, please, if you can go back to your first slide, please. Now, I know that there are people who probably will want to contact with you personally. So if I could suggest that, look, if you can contact the doctor via his email, which is on that slide, and also there's a Twitter account there as well. Just before we go on to the Q&A session, just like to ask you, if you want to ask a question or make a point, please put your hand up and I will let you in to speak. But of course, if you do not want to do that and you want to write something, then you're more than welcome to do that as well. But just before we go on to the session, I'd just like to share one personal reflection on this, is that at the moment and as it currently stands, the only system or the structural system that we have in the Muslim community to really pass on our faith and our values and our understanding and attitude in the UK and probably in other European countries as well is through the maktab and the weekend schools. State schools are almost non-existent. The Islamic faith schools, government-funded ones, they are very limited and restricted in terms of what they can do. Islamic schools are doing some work, but they are also restricted by government legislations, but at the same time, they're also restricted by resources and things like that. So we find that, in fact, a significant number of, in fact, almost 90+% of our children attend these maktabs or a weekend school. So it is now time for us to really focus on this sector. And I know that Dr. Abdullah Sahin has been banging on this idea for many years. And I think it's about time that we take up his ideas and start implementing at a grand level using a different network. But at the same time, and I think, I think one of the things that Dr. Abdullah Sahin has mentioned is that, different people may have different networks and different schools of thought. I don't think Doctor is challenging any of those things. All we're saying is that we need to professionalize the sector, make it more robust, make it, transformative, and it can be done, from your own angles as well. And you may want to personalize it to the way that you want to approach it. But the key thing is that we bring a professional approach to this whole sector, inshallah. Okay. Doctor, would you like to add anything on this before I go on to the...
Yeah, that is fantastic. And I must admit, my own research has been in this sector over now a decade. And as I said, finally, I have managed to find an opportunity to work with a willing university where we closely collaborate within an education department and teacher education. So we are hoping that although this experiment is quite new, this will hopefully lead into the next level of development, that is creation of some sort of national resource center, teacher education materials, and the sector within sort of itself could become transformative by attracting researchers, by attracting young people to come and become creative and have an interdisciplinary sort of experiment with other disciplines, so that really, we turn this very significant and large sector as a genuine cultural educational capital to empower our young people, and hopefully to ensure that intelligent Islamic faith development takes place. And that is so crucial for British Islam, European Islam, whatever to say, contemporary Islam, basically. So it is a kind of a significant step towards facilitating a mature Islamic presence in the modern world. So a lot is at stake. Don't simply see in a kind of a simple way. If you think the larger picture, what we are trying to do and what we are part of it, as of all of you as parents, teachers, coaches and guides, in fact, really we have to see beyond. That is, British Islam, European and contemporary Islamic presence requires this sector to become dynamic, transformative. Otherwise, the chances are, it will go backwards, stagnate, and all of the problems that are suffocating us will become detrimental, sadly.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Haji Idris, if you can please unmute yourself and ask your question. Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. I can never miss this opportunity of interacting.
MashaAllah. Second time lucky. Blessings from South Africa. Ahlan.
Alhamdulillah. Firstly, may Allah bless and lead our trust for the great work they are doing. And Dr. Abdullah, I must say, I always get enriched by your presentation. Just a question. One of the big challenges that I'm dealing with, and it's a global phenomena, lots of young people are leaving the fold of Islam, and many of them ascribe it to their Madrassah education. Now, I don't want to cast everyone in the same brush as it were. May Allah bless our teachers. They're trying very, very hard. Now, my question is this. Do you think that enough is being done to introduce our learners to Allah, the God of love, rather than Allah, only the God of wrath?
Jazakallah. Yes, this is really one of the fundamentals of the challenges we are facing. I said that we need to inculcate love of learning. Of course, love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the key. And you are right. Often, I myself work over now again 10 years with teachers who have been in the system as learners, now as educators. And they all pinpoint the phenomenon that you are describing, that sometimes the way in which we introduce Islam to young people is so rigid, it's so traumatic, sadly, that it leaves these young people to later on, once they are mature, to just simply, Allah, forgive us, to abandon even the faith. So the point is, because of the tarbiyah, the nurture, guidance and care, seems to have not been the first motive in this environment. Instruction, simple memorization, and obviously rigidity seems to be defining that whole experience for some. Not always, we are saying there are always exceptions, of course. But that is, it seems to be one of reasons why many young people, at least even if they don't live faith, they look like they need to have a kind of a period of coolness, leaving aside. And obviously, young people go through mainstream education. They are sort of schooled in a culture that values raising questions, values their autonomy, agency, respect their learning, where in some of the madrassas and maktab education, sadly, this is not the case. So children don't feel they're special, don't feel they're respected in terms of their personal development. And the result is, unfortunately, unintentionally, the madrasa maktab education could be a hindrance. This is what I was trying to hint at by the ethics of this maktab madrasa education. So our teachers really need to take this into account seriously. And if we have this childhood and adolescent stages, because most of the problems occur in adolescent years where young people are full of questions, and if the maktab madrasa doesn't listen to them, the chances are they actually quite drift away from faith, sadly. So we need to have a transformative Islamic education that is able to listen, respond, and help them to grow with all their problems into an Islamic sense of really person, growth into faith. It is such an important really area that I always encourage my students to actually research into this and find out the impact of the learning and teaching habits we embody now in our madrasas. It is impact on the attitudes and the link that these young people have with faith, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they leave these institutions. Jazakallah khair.
Haji Idris, would you like to have a comment on that? Add a comment? Right, okay. Brother Amjad, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shaheen, mashallah. Thank you very much for a lovely presentation. The point I'd like to make is that we have an absence of a unified pedagogy for Islamic studies. Given that we come from different schools of thoughts, do you think there is a pedagogy that can cut through all that, and that we can come up with something that all the madrasas can agree on?
Jazakallah khairan. Yes, I think there is this Tarbiyah model. I think it could be a unifying pedagogic concept as well.
Right.
As I said, because it is based on the Quran and prophetic practice, which is shared across different denominations, different schools of thought. I think Tarbiyah could, particularly in the maktab and madrasa context, could be a unifying pedagogic concept, but we need to attend to the transformative meanings in this concept, because the word is being used often as a kind of a moral concept only. As we have discovered, it is actually beyond that. It pinpoints towards learning and teaching that is dynamic, reflective, and it always prioritizes learners' development rather than the authority of the teachers or culture around. So I believe that, yes, this Tarbiyah, if it is properly understood, educationally as well as scholarly in Islamic tradition, could give us a unified pedagogic vision where we will try to implement as much as we can in all these three levels of management, leadership, the actual materials, teacher education, and assessment. I think it could be an overall sort of benchmark framework where we can even benchmark not only learning, but also the competence of the teachers who are going to facilitate that provision.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.
Haji Idris, would you like to add a comment on some of the points? Haji Idris?
Hello?
Hello, Haji Idris.
Yes.
All right, would you like to add a comment on some of those points?
Yeah. You see, a very
We lost you.
critical aspect is this, scribe to. Now what happens is this, if it, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the big challenges is this, and I had this challenge, for example, when your teachers are products of different Darul Ulums, they would, cascade what they have learned, and they forget that the students they've got there come from diverse backgrounds. And this is what it requires a lot of maturity. Look at areas that are common and discuss those particular areas and show them that people can all attain the truth from different pathways. And this is something we need to understand. So the critical thing is this, one of the things that I always remember is it is said we teach who we are. And in the end, it's the teacher as a role model, as a person with deep understanding, who loves his learners, who engages with them, and in that way is able to unleash the potential. And this is a fundamental thing. The moment a school becomes narrow in its thinking, it then excludes people that have a different thought. There's no such thing in Islam, a unidimensional Islam. Islam is multidimensional. What you say and I say, what you say is right and what I say can also be right. So we need to understand the ethics of disagreement also.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think, inclusiveness is the word I like. And I think we have to create inclusive environments. But as I say, the point is not much the results, but really confidence, inspiration building, and with the accurate knowledge to enable children to engage and to reflect of what they're learning, rather than ideological engagement with creating certain narratives of identity in the learners. We've got to trust our young people. And as I said, these young people, generally Islamic literacy is not meant to be creating alims or alimas. The tarbiyah we want from this age group is basic Islamic literacy, is to be able to see right from wrong in terms of Islamic knowledge, and to engage in internalizing Islamic values as much as they can. And that requires, again, centrality of the teacher as the guide, coach, and someone who understands psychology of learning, psychology of development of children. I think this is where we have not prioritized in terms of investment in resourcing maktab and madrasas. And of course, sadly, Darul Ulooms themselves have their own pedagogic challenges. This is also an Islamic education, significant sector. We might look later on. But sadly, most of the graduates end up facilitating maktab madrasa, sometimes perpetuating the problem, sadly. So we need to really make it sure that Darul Ulooms, as Islamic seminaries, they're aware of this function of some of their graduates, hence providing with the opportunity of developing a language of education, pedagogy, and develop these mentoring skills where they would need most, rather than a lot of ilm when they go to maktab madrasa, and guiding young people in today's highly challenging context. And diversity is a major theme. We've got to teach in our maktab madrasas how Islam has a deep appreciation of diversity. We talk about tarbiyah containing ta'aruf, learning from one another, key concept. The second aspect of transformative education is ta'aruf concept. That is, being eager to learn from one another and tolerate one another's difference. And I think we have such, creative pedagogic educational ideas in our tradition, but we're just simply not making use of these concepts. And that really pains me. And, when I see that Islamic education is reduced to instruction, memorization, and not interested in human condition, it just pains me. And again, we don't need to change camps or schools of thought. This is generic, basic Islamic tarbiyah model available in our tradition. It cut across all of the traditions, I would say. But we need to do this with the zeal of guiding young people, rather than simply claiming their agency, shaping their agency in the way we want. That is just not, it should not be the way forward. So that requires education to become a genuinely respected professional area of development in Islamic education. We cannot do this unless we train our educators in not only in ilm, but also in social sciences, psychology, education sciences. And that's why I always say time has arrived in Europe that we need Islamic teacher education colleges. We definitely need this. Otherwise, we're going to literally waste our energy with these sometimes offered short courses and all these interesting activities that are happening, none of which are building actually developmental, accumulative, resource building opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Dr. Azam. Again, a lot of interesting points to consider. And I mean, one of the things that I observed, Dr. Abdullah Sahin, is that a lot of these institutions, these weekend madrassas as well as evening madrassas, they are very much set up in line with ethnic backgrounds.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes that model of ethnic background, although it actually brings some of the communities together, but it can also create an element of segregation. Likewise, I think, going back to the school of thought, we are, I mean, I don't know how it's in other cities in the UK and possibly in other countries as well, but in London, as you know, it's a very dynamic area where people live in one area, they're from all different schools of thought. And sometimes we find that the institutions are not so accommodating to the views and perspective of people from other communities. How do we go on about dealing with this notion?
Yeah. Well, this is a very important question. So we have intra-community diversity that we need to first acknowledge and respect. So in other words, we are aware that our communities are linguistically, culturally different, and these differences could be seen as potential, as I said, a positive element that we should not simply dismiss. Now, school of thought, this is an ideological take. This is a bit difficult to harness because obviously young people, particularly young educators and community leaders, they are, in other words, once you're part of an organization, you have that kind of zeal. Now, sadly, religious authority in Europe, Islamic authority, spirituality, hasn't quite settled in a mature way to guide this diversity. So we do obviously need to, look at the wider problem. We need, faith leaders who are capable of acknowledging intra-faith diversity, difference, understanding where they come from, and then, if possible, to reconcile, if not, to live with our differences. This is the Quranic Islamic educational principle. The Quran doesn't want everybody to be the same. We know that from Muhammad ﷺ's school, let us say he was running a school in Medina, in Sufa, in his blessed mosque. We had companions who all sort of fulfill their own personalities. Umar radiallahu anh is not like Osman radiallahu anh. Osman is not like Abu Bakr. So these differences of personality, culture, were all seen as educational actually resources and richness. And therefore, even there were different opinions in terms of matters of interpretation of faith. So, this whole notion that there got to be only one truth and that's it, the rest are wrong, is kind of, again, put into a category mistake. So we need to really make sure that we have a mature Islamic faith leadership that are capable of understanding intra-faith differences and hopefully advocating a position where we bring this together. After all, the Prophet, peace be upon him, famously says, there is no benefit from someone who is unable to either join in a kind of a group or join in a solidarity or lead a community. So join in, la khayra fi man la yajma' wa la yujma'. La ya'laf wa la yu'laf, Muhammad ﷺ says. So the community spirit is so strong in Islam. You have to be obviously part of a community, but also, if you cannot, you can sometimes have a leadership quality. You have to lead a community. So we have diversity of these examples in our tradition. We have to really invoke these principles where diversity is always seen in principle as positive, And then, based on evidence, engagement is facilitated. And therefore, the kind of intra-faith dimension doesn't become hindrance, sadly dismissal, but an experience of tolerance, acknowledgement, and benefiting from one another and complementing one another. Because often this difference goes back to people's personalities rather than actually difference of opinion in terms of maslaks and then manhaj. So we do need to inculcate faith leadership that could rise to the challenge and address this intra-faith diversity, as well as obviously interfaith diversity, which is another level of this same question. So the issue of diversity should be, for example, one of the key themes in our madrassas. Children, they grow up with difference. We have to acknowledge this difference in our madrassah, and they need to learn how to address, how to manage diversity, not other way around, simply dismiss them and avoid them and pretend it doesn't exist. And again, all of this requires having teachers who are willing to guide young people towards that kind of inclusiveness dimension and developing a tolerance, respect of living with diversity and difference. So there are many levels of really madrasa education to be looked at in terms of turning it into a resource and a capital for young people. And diversity is one of the key. And again, we don't have time to talk about, but we have to look at for this, adolescence, post-adolescent years, when young people engage in this long journey of ilm. They spend time in Egypt, in Medina, India. They come back to this country to act as faith leaders. We have to look at, if you spend 10 years of your life outside, London, how could you come back and guide young children in the midst of London? So this is a very fascinating area of really reflection for Islamic education to look at. But sadly, all problems are interconnected. And we need to ensure that our young generation of faith leaders are at ease with this diversity, and they do not lose sight on the fact that diversity is actually could be seen as creativity.
Thank you, Dr. Haji Idris. You'd like to make a comment? Please unmute yourself. Haji Idris.
Yes, Dr. Abdullah Sahin, one of your recurring themes has always been that we need to develop thinking individuals. This is something the Quran constantly makes us want to reflect and so on and so forth. But today you find that often children are seen as passive receptacles of knowledge. And one of the things that we find because of that, they find it very, very difficult to debate issues about Islam. They find it difficult. They become emotional. There's a lot of vitriol in their discussion. It impacts on relationships. So I remember a friend of mine once said, instead of being a skeptic, you must be a healthy skeptic. In other words, saying that no matter what you believe in, if someone presents to you evidence that is so compelling, then you must be prepared to modify your views. And you find that our system, sadly, does not give children an opportunity to ask questions. Secondly, to engage with them. And thirdly, we find that we often speak in a theoretical way, So I'm not too sure, in terms of your own experience, how can we develop the thinking individual who is prepared to interrogate his own responses?
This is the very crucial point. Personhood is at the very heart of Islamic education. You're absolutely right. Therefore, in these 10 features, one of the key features is help children connect and integrate. So we spend too much time in passing on knowledge and transmission, rather than enabling children to be able to manage that knowledge, digest that knowledge, and internalize its values. That means really to grow into becoming a human being, basically, the art of being human. So this idea of personhood, I do believe that Islam essentially advocates personalism, rather than kind of a group herd mentality. Muhammad famously says you've got to really inbuilt a kind of a consciousness, moral, ethical awareness. So taqwa is all about that. How do you develop an awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's a personal journey. You have to really understand how that journey takes place. Istafti qalbak, Muhammad says, ask in terms of simply asking fatwas from people how to live. Why don't you consult with your heart? Muhammad says. But these are very beautiful educational pedagogic motives that tells us that becoming a mature human being is at the very heart of Islamic education. The Tarbiyah model, therefore, it is not Islamic un-Islamic. The word Tarbiyah is a shumuli, it is a holistic concept. The idea is it takes life journey to fulfill one's potential, to grow into mature personality. So we therefore we need to really make it sure most of our educators who are involved in teaching in Madrassah, they must study, as I always say, child psychology, developmental psychology. It is something that I myself personally discovered. I was a graduate of theology. I never had psychological education, but when I looked at education issues, I realized how psychology, educational psychology are the key, because it enables you to appreciate how people are different and how could you facilitate growth into personhood. And faith development, how does it take place? Identity development, how does it take place? These are the areas where we need to encourage young educators to also develop knowledge understanding, not simply highly cognitive body of knowledge, information, and passing that on. And of course, we know that the Quran is at pains in critiquing such models. The knowledge itself is really not the aim. It's how you use that knowledge, put it into your life is the key. The ethics of the knowledge is the key, rather than the knowledge itself. So you may know little, but that little could nourish your soul and heart, could actually trigger you, grow into your personality. And if you look at our young people, they are going through complex challenges. Modern life is very challenging, but intergenerational change is reality. The diversity of experience are reality. We need to really respond to this highly demanding set of circumstances that young people are going through and reflect this in our teaching of Islam, in our ways of facilitating growth into faith or faith development. So all of this really requires, as I said, it cannot be simply done as a supplementary so-called mindset. We need to really put this not as supplement at the very core of community educational activity. And that requires a bit of rethinking and introducing some professional way of framing the facilitators of this whole sector. Jazakallah.
Thank you, Doctor. And just before we close up, you mentioned something really, really powerful, which I personally believe in. Diversity allows for creativity.
Absolutely.
But I think personally, from my observation of particularly the Muslim community here and also abroad, the word diversity has become more of a problem. And often people don't want to go into that and explore that word a little bit. The reason being is because they will be almost, their institutions or them will be excommunicated from the herd mentality that you were talking about. So they are kind of almost, because a lot of those groups have got political allegiance to different countries, these Islamic groups, which are propagating these things, or some of them have developed other groups. And so they are enforcing the herd mentality through their institutions. How do you tackle that, Doctor?
Yeah, well, this is the fundamental leadership challenge. We have to look at how do we educate our own leaders. And I say this again, someone who is from within the community now. We have to look at where our faith leaders come from. So they come from Darul Ulooms, they come from various Islamic theological schools. I mentioned why so many of our young people, they go to various places abroad to gain knowledge and to develop leadership skills. And then, of course, come back as part of these networks to operate as kind of satellite. I call this kind of an implicit dawah model, which is, it is good to have a kind of a mission, but sadly, still the infrastructure we have for Islamic faith leadership reproduces this kind of sadly sectarian sort of sensitivities, rather than really rising to the challenge of addressing the problems that facing our young people. So that is in itself, it requires maybe a separate reflection and talk. But I would say this question of being at ease with diversity and having a leadership that is at ease, seeing the limitations of having this, banker mentality is crucial to check, the Quran, the prophetic tradition, the Islamic traditions. We just mentioned, about Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, how he himself saw that glass that was covering his head needs to be shattered in terms of seeing the wider context and the wider diversity and adopting a kind of an inquiring mindset. So that is a question of leadership, really, faith, leadership, education, and leadership. And we need to, and I have confidence because I work a lot with Muslim young faith leaders who often attend my courses at work. So I remain still hopeful that there is this young generations who are actually product of, let's say, British context. They are much more aware of the challenges, and they understand that we need to adopt a constructive attitude in resolving, because the kind of intra-sectarian sort of attitude is not going to really resolve the problems, as we are losing our young people gradually. So there is this awareness, and I'm hoping that as we kind of develop a professional attitude to Islamic faith leadership education, this theme of diversity and the contextual reality will be taken very seriously, and then we will have an honest debate and dialogue, an open reflection. Ultimately, we want to find out what Islam says about these issues. And therefore, this kind of dialogical process will guide us, and hopefully will bring about young faith leadership that are genuinely interested in becoming part of addressing issues, not only knowledge, understanding of Islam, but also poverty, vulnerabilities that our communities face, and helping our communities to prosper. These are all part of the same education outlook, inspiration within our community. I think this all requires that we prioritize Islamic education really as a professional area of investment development. I don't see, if we do not do that, we will still leave the whole scene to these sectarian takes and these networks that they dominate, of course, and they not always, sadly, prioritize the interests of Islam or young people's interests.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Doctor, for once again a very insightful session, and a lot to think about. And I'm sure participants, you will agree that Doctor has, and I think one person wrote on the chat box that the sessions actually raises a lot more questions. And I'm so glad that we are now asking those questions. And the question is the beginning of that reform and the transformation that we are exploring and we're looking at. So I hope these, what I would say, theoretical sessions of this program has raised those conceptual questions, and also for you to reflect on the practices that you are involved in your own areas. But as we move forward in this course, we will have sessions that will focus on more practical elements of how different institutions and different people are implementing some of those ideas in their own setting. And I think the key thing is that they're doing it in their own unique way. And so these are different models that we can learn from. One of the key things that we are at Needed Trust that is really kind of driving through is this whole idea of integrated transformative education. And that very much, I mean, this idea very much comes from, Dr. Abdullah Sahin, as well as Professor Rajab Shentok, who is the president of Ibn Khaldun University. But I mean, they're kind of the modern scholars on that respect. But the other scholars that we kind of very heavily rely on is Allama Iqbal and Imam Ghazali. And we believe that particularly in the Western context now, we really need to drive this initiative forward, a model of integrated transformative education that includes the different stakeholders, not just teachers, but includes all the different stakeholders who are involved in this process of education. And so it's an attitudinal change. It's an attitude that we have to change over a period of time, rather than the instructional model, which continue to exist, or a model to actually protect one particular idea or a school of thought. Now we need to actually make it bigger, not only just amongst the Muslims, but we also need to think about the wider society as well. how do the Islamic model contribute to the wider society? And some of the key principles that we are really trying to drive forward is this idea of being inclusive, promoting excellence in our model, promoting dynamism, and promoting academics. And I think this academic here, we're talking about developing people who are critical thinkers. So it's about developing their intellect. And finally, linking them to their tradition. And under tradition, we are looking at their history, their heritage, and so that they can form their unique identity. At the moment, unfortunately and sadly, because of the circumstances that has happened in the Muslim world, unfortunately, you know, our Muslim community have got what we call a dichotomized or a dysfunctional identity situation that we are in. So it is important that we go back and we link back to our historical tradition. And these are some of the ideas that Dr. Abdullah Sahin, as well as Professor Rajab, they talk about all the time. This identity formation, you know, how do we actually develop that identity formation? And it is about going back to our tradition and developing it from there, and then implementing it in a modern context. So, you know, so the ideas that has come through in those 3 sessions, it's very much in line with the initiative that we're trying to actually develop as a trust through our supplementary school teachers network, through our school leaders network, through our African scholars network, through our Turkish educators network, through our Somali teachers network, and also through our teachers network and our parents network, because we realize that all these different stakeholders can play a big role. So once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And we hope to see you again on Wednesday. Wednesday's session will be taken by Brother Waqas from Ilm to Amal. They are developing some really interesting resources, which is very much in line with Dr. Abdullah Sahin's ideas. And so I think it will be really good for you to actually log in and inshallah see how the type of resources that they're developing for this transformative education as well. And of course, we got the next session on next Sunday as well. Please do register on our website if you have not registered yet. But at the same time, we will let you know of further programs via emails. We will also share our YouTube channel with you, and also we'll share the PowerPoints with you as well. Once again, thank you very much, and please forgive us for any shortcomings. And inshallah, we will see you in the next program. Can I please ask all the participants if you can please,
Can I just say also, Sheikh Brother,
yeah.
Can I just say that thank you for NIDA for organizing this continuous professional development series. I really enjoyed these 3 seminars that we had on transformative Islamic education. So we are really grateful for an organization like NIDA, who is really trying to bring various interested stakeholders together. And really, this is brilliant. Practitioners, academics, as well as parents. So it is something that quite uniquely delivered, facilitated by NIDA. So we also register our gratitude and thanks to the leadership of NIDA. And I think the service that you are doing is just brilliant by honoring this whole field that needs to be taken seriously. I enjoyed these 3 sessions. Those who wish to continue learning or looking at this model are welcome to look at our programs at Warwick. I've got some fantastic students who I work with, who are obviously now publishing and becoming part of this professional development. And really, we are building a kind of Islamic education learning community at Warwick. So please remain in touch with this community and allow them, of course, whatever work they are doing to also share with you. So hopefully, we are genuinely trying to make Islamic education as part of the solution of our communities rather than a hindrance by making it transformative. So jazakumullah khair, and wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alameen.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think that just before I close, can I just say there's one person who has actually sent a message to say that respect the advertised time. I did make it very clear at the beginning that after an hour you're welcome to leave. There's no obligation for you to stay. It's only if people want to stay, they're welcome to stay, and we have kept it open because there are a lot of queries and questions that people have. So please do bear in mind that we do not force you to stay. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Doctor. And if I could ask Dr. Abdullah Sahin and also Nida Trust members to stay online for another few more minutes, inshallah, while the participants leave the meeting. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.